right, welcome to lecture 6 of the MISU Drought seminar. I am Professor Toby Alt. Today we're going to talk about the dynamical causes of drought in the atmosphere and the sources of atmospheric variations that lead to drought that lie in the ocean. Quick recap of ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. I'm sure most of you are reasonably familiar with it, but because it's very relevant to drought around the world, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. So right in the center here of this diagram, we have normal conditions in the Pacific Ocean. So on the right, you see Central America. On the left, that's Australia. Right in the equatorial region, that's the edge of Indonesia. And under normal conditions, the winds blow from the eastern Pacific to the west. This causes upwelling off the coast of Peru, and cooler waters emerge in that upwelling zone on the eastern side of the basin. The winds then move the water across the Pacific Ocean near the equator. And as that water moves, it is warmed by sunlight, by infrared and solar radiation, until it gets to be really quite warm on the Western Pacific and fuels significant convection, huge convective storms and a climatological convective region in the Western Pacific there. And that's shown with the red bullseye on the left, as well as the convective storms above it. So that's normal. On this side, we have El Nino conditions, and that's what happens when that normal tropical circulation pattern breaks down and reorganizes, so the convection is displaced towards the Central Pacific. And one of the reasons why this happens is because in the normal climatological setting, the thermocline, the layer of warm water, is deeper in the west than in the east. And so you get this buildup of warm water, a significant warm water volume accumulates in the Western Pacific. And part of what happens during El Nino is that bathtub of warm water that's built up in the west and is held in place by the winds migrates towards the Central Pacific, and the whole thing sort of sloshes over, and the thermocline flattens, it shallows in the west, deepens in the east, and the convection, huge convective systems that are usually characterized by their position in the Western Pacific, end up anchored and set in the Central Pacific. And as you can imagine, that will disrupt storm tracks and the position of convection and other precipitation patterns all around the world. La Nina conditions, on the other hand, are sort of like an enhanced version of normal, and they typically follow El Nino years. And in the La Nina context, the convection is pushed to the Western Pacific. The warm water volume, the warm water pool is also pushed further west. The thermocline is deeper in the west and shallower in the east. So you see cooler sea surface temperatures in the east from the upwelling that's occurring off the coast of Central America. So that's the El Nino La Nina basic pattern that we're referring to. As far as what it does to weather downstream, the case that I'm most familiar with is the Western North American or North American context. During El Nino years, one typically sees that the jet stream is further south, and the US Southwest and Southeast will get wetter because the storm tracks more often are moving to this drier, at least in the Western context, the drier part of the Southwest during winter time. Whereas in the Northwest, here in Oregon, Washington, much of the western and northern sector of the North American continent is a little warmer and maybe sees fewer storms, so a little drier as well. That's the effect of El Nino. By moving that tropical convection around, it shifts the jet stream. The effect of La Nina is not quite opposite, but somewhat symmetric in the sense that it moves the jet stream, or it weights the dice so that the jet stream tends to end up further north. The storm tracks tend to be further north. The Pacific Northwest gets wetter. The American Southwest gets drier, and parts of Canada get colder as well. So those are just two downstream impacts of this El Nino La Nina phenomena. And the way that we monitor the El Nino La Nina, the state of the El Nino La Nina system, the ENSO system, among other things, is this NINO3.4 sea surface temperature index. And this is just a simple sea surface temperature average from the central Western Pacific. And when the values are high and more positive, above 1 degree, up to 2 degrees, or more, those are El Nino events. And when the values are negative, those are La Nina events. And what I want you to pay attention to here, notice from this diagram, see it everywhere, is that there's very strong interannual variability. El Nino and La Nina typically occur every few years. You get an El Nino event, so 3 to 7, 2 to 7 years. That's like the characteristic time scale that you'll come across for El Nino phenomena. In other words, and why this is important for drought is that every few years, the position of convection in the Pacific Ocean moves substantially. We're talking about thousands of kilometers from the Western Pacific to the Central Pacific during El Nino, and then more often than not, back to the extreme Western Pacific for La Nina. And that effect has downstream, ripple impacts. And we would expect, just knowing how important the atmosphere is for transporting moisture for drought, to see that in various drought indicators. And so that's exactly what I'm trying to show here. And this is from our 2020 science review paper. The Niño 3.4 region, from which I just showed the sea surface temperature average, is right there in the center, the Central Pacific. I've correlated that Niño 3.4 time series with summer, so boreal summer, June, July, August average PDSI, to draw out those effects of El Nino and La Nina on global hydroclimate. So you can see some of the things that I just talked about. Positive correlation with the American Southwest, negative correlation with the Northwest. There's also a big impact on the Nordeste region of Brazil. You can see in Australia, South Africa, Indonesia. Those are some key regions that are affected by El Nino and La Nina phenomena. And we can see that just in this very simple correlation analysis. Now, there are other modes of variability besides El Nino and La Nina. And so this is a paper from a few years ago I did with Kayla Dolan, and we looked, it was primarily her work, I should say. I was on the paper as a courtesy and as a person who was interested in the work, because I think it's important, but I did very little of the actual analysis. So what she did was she correlated other indicators of modes, other time series like ENSO, with the leaf area index. So another indicator of, well, in this case, plant health globally at very high spatial resolution. So let me just walk you through which modes there are here. So ENSO is the one that we talked about before. So the correlation pattern here that looks somewhat similar to the one that I just showed. She also looked at the NAO, which is the North Atlantic Oscillation, the Indian Ocean dipole mode, so that operates in the Indian Ocean. It also has an interannual time scale of variability to it. It's sort of like a miniature, you can think of it like a miniature ENSO, and the Atlantic multi-decadal mode. And you can see there's different spatial imprints of most of these, although this AMM has a fairly weak impact compared to the other three. Another interesting aspect of her analysis, and really, one of the points of this, and this is really the take home from this analysis, is just an example of the kind of analysis you might do when you're trying to look for a signal of these modes of variability in some hydroclimate indicator. The point that she was making in this paper is that the imprint of any mode, even ENSO, varies by space and also throughout the season. And so here she's showing the part of the year when the correlations are the strongest. When you look at these correlations here, this is like the peak correlation occurs during some part of the year, and that's what's being colorized in this diagram. So for example, the peak impact of ENSO on this part of Brazil and the Amazon is sort of June, July, right in there. Whereas the peak imprint of ENSO on the US Southwest is somewhere in sort of either the May, April monsoon season, or all the way back to January of the previous winter, if you're looking at these red spots. Same with the Pacific Northwest, you see big impact in January. Now, this is important to be aware of if you're working with any drought indicator, really, especially if you work with ecological data, where there's the instantaneous effect, there's the instantaneous state of the system, say of ENSO or any other climate mode, and then there can be a lagged effect. So it's both the impact in a month-to-month sense, as well as the delayed impacts that for an ecosystem might not show up for another few weeks or months. All right, so now moving on to some of the mechanisms the dynamics that cause drought. This is from a paper 2009, Schubert et al. That I like because it does a really nice job of explaining how we set up some of these idealized sea surface temperature forcing experiments. In the most basic sense, we all kind of know that atmospheric fluctuations cause changes in the amount of moisture that's delivered to a particular site, and therefore disruptions in the atmosphere can cause changes to the amount of moisture that gets delivered to a particular location, and as a consequence can result in drought. What this experiment tries to do is ask, well, what are the patterns of ocean sea surface temperature variability that can lead to atmospheric changes that can lead to drought? There's a couple steps there, right? We want to explore the patterns of sea surface temperature variability. So El Nino is one of them. We talked about it here, and it's shown here as this is a principal components analysis. This is like the spatial pattern of El Nino in sea surface temperature on the left, and on the right in the middle here is the time series, principal components time series associated with this pattern. So when this pattern is very strongly expressed and this principal component is positive, that means the ocean looks a lot like this pattern. So the higher this value is here in the positive sense, PC2, the more the ocean looks like this sea surface temperature anomaly map. And the more negative PC2 is, the more it looks like this map, but with the colors, with the anomalies reversed. That's basically principal component EOF analysis in a nutshell. The first one up here, I skipped it, so I wanted to emphasize ENSO. We already talked about it. But the first one up here is the trend component. So the trend component to sea surface temperature has a really well-defined spatial pattern, as does this North Atlantic mode, sometimes called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. And what the authors do in this study, and this is it's a special issue, and so there were a number of related studies, but I think they really capture the essence of what's important in trying to tease out what happens in the oceans to cause drought. They've taken different combinations of these modes. So taking the Pacific to be a warm, so like an El Nino, fixing it to be in that El Nino state, taking the Atlantic also, let's say, as a warm combination or neutral combination, and running an atmospheric model with those sea surface temperature anomalies to then look at what happens to the precipitation downstream. And here's one example of what you get from this kind of an analysis. So these are 5 different older models, and they are being forced with different sea surface temperature patterns, anomaly patterns. The 2 that I just mentioned, the Pacific pattern, this one here, is held to be warm, and the Atlantic pattern, the one down here, is held to be neutral. The model is run for like 50 years. And then they're just looking at the anomalies in surface pressure and precipitation. So let's walk through what this is actually showing. These colors, the orange or the green, are the precipitation anomalies in each model, each atmosphere model, forced with the sea surface temperature conditions corresponding to what looks like that would look like a permanent El Nino for a prolonged 50-year El Nino event. And what's important is that you actually see relative increases in precipitation in, say, the Central Pacific. Well, we would expect that because we know from our little ENSO recap at the beginning that tropical convection tends to be anchored more towards the Central Pacific, and that leads to anomalously high precipitation in the Central Pacific. And you see that in all these models. To first order, all these models are reproducing that. At the same time, you see negative anomalies. So drying in, say, Indonesia, parts of Northern Australia, in most of these models, that corresponds to the removal of that climatological convective precipitation and its migration towards the Central Pacific. So that's like the direct, immediate impact of El Nino on the atmosphere, and the models are capturing that effect. They're also doing some of the downstream effects as well. So we see the anomalies, say, during El Nino in the US Southwest or the Southeast, the western, southwestern parts of the US. But you also could notice that the individual models that are being used here differ in their spatial patterns. The regional details are not the same. These are not the exact same maps from one experiment to the next, from one modeling system to the next. And that's really important because that's getting at the uncertainty in how sea surface temperature anomalies are actually transmitted to the land surface through the atmosphere. And that's real uncertainty that arises from the model systems themselves, from other sources of internal atmospheric variability, And it's something to be aware of with this kind of an experiment. If you end up needing to use it or pursue it, or you have to rely on these simulations or others that have been done in subsequent years, where there is an idealized sea surface temperature anomaly, the response that you get in the atmosphere and the response that you see downstream on land is going to be sensitive to the climate or atmospheric modeling framework that you're using. The sea surface temperature experiments that I was describing before can give you insight into the signal on land and in drought that you get from anomalies in the ocean sea surface temperature patterns. But they don't dig deeper into the atmosphere itself unless you apply some sort of moisture budget analysis. And so a basic moisture budget in this sense means that we're trying to characterize and track the flow of water vapor through the atmosphere and its sources and sinks, and how those sources and sinks can lead to drought. We're going to use this conservation of water vapor differential equation, which I'll walk you through here on the left, and you can read more in the papers that I'll put at the end that address these analyses. They're really an important fundamental tool that we have to use for understanding drought. There's the partial derivative of Q. So we'll just say dq dt. So this is the time derivative plus v, this is our velocity or wind velocity field, times the gradient of Q plus omega dq dp. So this is change of Q with height. And omega is our vertical wind speed, has to equal the evapotranspiration minus precipitation. So let's just take a second to think about what this means. Changes in Q with time. So that's the local tendency term. Is it raining, or is water being added to the atmosphere right now from the land surface, or is it raining out? Plus the advection of moisture by the winds, plus the vertical transport of moisture has to be balanced by the evapotranspiration minus precipitation. So what's happening in the atmosphere has to be balanced by what's being seen at the surface. Those two, are in equilibrium, because water can't. We're not destroying water, right? Like, so if it rains out of the sky, it rained because the amount of moisture reaching that location exceeded the capacity of the atmosphere to hold that moisture. And conversely, if there's a net loss of moisture to evapotranspiration, it's because more moisture is being advected away and evaporated than is being returned to that location through the atmosphere. So to break this down even further, and again, you can look at this paper by Demetrius Herrera. You have on the left the precipitation minus evapotranspiration balance is going to be, as we said before, the precipitable water tendency. So that's the time varying, the sort of localized instantaneous rate of change in precipitable water, combined with now we've separated out the divergence and advection. And this is what I want to sort of highlight here, because I think it's just like a linear algebra rule that we can apply to our differential equations to look at moisture budgets. And what it gives us is two different terms inside the parentheses here that correspond to two different types of processes in the advection of moisture through the atmosphere. So the first one is Q times the gradient of the wind field. So this is this is really Q times the wind divergence. So if the mean flow of the wind is converging or diverging, and you held the water vapor source the same, you might get a drought or you might not, but that would be purely a function of the divergence or convergence of the atmosphere and not related to the amount of moisture that the atmosphere was transporting. In a simple sense, you just think of this as like the wind speed itself. Not quite the same, but it's a simple way of looking at it. This first term is how much do changes in the wind account for changes in the amount of water vapor, versus, in this case, we say, well, what if we're holding the wind field constant, in a sense? How much do changes in the gradient of moisture or the availability of moisture contribute to the precipitable water at a given site? So in a one-dimensional sense, you could imagine, in the first case, if what we're doing is we're holding the water vapor constant and changing the winds, that's going to have an effect on how much water vapor is actually available, because it affects how much is being transported there. In the second sense, we're holding the winds constant and we are modifying the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. And both of those, they're in the advective term here, but it's been rewritten in a way that lets us disentangle them. And we can break this down a step further. So these are some of the questions that moisture budgets can be used to address. You can look at the mean flow, advection of moisture by the eddies. If you think about how how moisture actually moves through the atmosphere, there are several different dynamical processes that are responsible for it. And moisture budgets let you look at which of those processes, the transient eddies, stationary eddies, mean flow, local convection, which of those processes are actually dominating any changes that emerge in a drought signal. Exactly what Demetrius did in his analysis, and you can look at the paper if you want more insight and details, but I just want to give you a visual representation of just the climatology here for how this plays out, because in the Caribbean region where he's looking, it turns out both effects are important and they're not the same and they don't have the same sign. Well, this is just the climatology of P minus E at the surface with the wind field overlaid. And all this analysis is designed to take apart, really tease apart, dissect that wind field and its effect on the transport of water vapor throughout the annual cycle. All right, I will put up the references for this lecture and its own standalone slide. Thank you all very much for listening.